The claim that Matthew 24:36 marks a transition from the topic of the destruction of Jerusalem to a discussion about the end of the material universe is the heartbeat of the AD 33 doctrine's treatment of the Olivet Discourse. But what if I told you that this is an eisegetical imposition, rather than a sound, exegetical conclusion? What if I told you that the disciples never inquired about the end of the material cosmos? Scripture, interpreting Scripture, and spiritual things compared to spiritual things, 1 Corinthians 2:13, reveals that instead of the presuppositional opinion that they asked about the end of time, their questions were framed around the covenantal end of the Mosaic age. Jesus had repeatedly taught them specifically about the end of their current age in his parables, and the disciples affirmed their understanding of this topic in Matthew 13:51, after he explained that the harvest is the end of this age, Matthew 13:39 and 40, and then again in the follow-up parable of the great dragnet of Matthew 13:47 through 50. Their questions in Matthew 24:3, when harmonized with Mark 13:4 and Luke 21:7, make it obvious to the unbiased mind that they were concerned with the destruction of the temple, the sign of his coming, and the end of the age, not the end of the material universe. As Jesus and his apostles were admiring the magnificent stones of the temple buildings, Mark 13:1, what linguistic, contextual, textual, or Hebraic evidence is there to indicate that the dismantling of that Jewish temple would trigger them to ask about the end of the material universe, and the end of all of human history? The AD 33 doctrine proponents exercise some fantastic word gymnastics to overlay this idea of the end of creation into a discussion about the raising of the Jewish temple. The AD 33 doctrine argues that Matthew 24:36 marks a distinct transition from discussing the fall of Jerusalem to an event thousands of years removed, based on the phrase, "But of that day and hour no one knows." However, the uncertainty regarding the exact day and hour of the timing had already been introduced earlier in the discourse. In Matthew 24:20, Jesus told his disciples to pray that their flight would not take place in winter, nor on the Sabbath. If the occurrence of the event was contingent on seasonal or covenantal factors, then the exact timing was already uncertain prior to verse 36. The irony exemplified by the AD 33 doctrine is thick, in that it can't see the haystack for looking at the needle. Jesus clearly identified the century, and the generation, even though he did not specify the exact hour. Futurists ignore the specified century, and generation, and continue to pitch the hour forward, century after century, and generation after generation. The linguistics reinforce the continuity of thought with the inclusio structure found between Matthew 24:27 through verses 37 and 39. The Greek phrase, hautos este he parousia to huiou to anthropou, translated to the English phrase, so also will be the coming of the Son of Man, appears in verse 27, then is repeated verbatim in verses 37 and 39. This linguistically demonstrates that the subject matter remains the same throughout, from verse 27 through verse 39. Since verse 27 is referent to the judgment upon Israel, to be marked by the destruction of Jerusalem and Israel's temple, then verses 37 and 39 must likewise be the same subject, since Jesus uses the identical Greek phrase, twice, after verse 36, as he uses the analogy of the days of Noah, and says, so also will be the coming of the Son of Man. There is no textual justification, nor linguistic authorization for imposing a shift in topic between these verses. The AD 33 doctrine attempts to avoid this linguistic hurdle by appealing to the Greek phrase, peride, in verse 36. Futurists assert that this phrase, peride, rendered, but of, that day and hour, is consistently used throughout the New Testament as a distinct transition from one subject to another. However, this is demonstrably false. Even a precursory survey of the usages of this phrase readily refutes this assertion of the AD 33 doctrine. A key factor in properly understanding Matthew 24:36 is realizing that the phrase, peride, used at the beginning of the verse, appears 18 times in the New Testament, and is consistently used to shift focus of what is already under discussion, rather than to introduce an entirely new subject. Beginning in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, for instance, Paul uses peride to shift to another subject. However, of the 18 times this phrase is used, this is the only instance which can be demonstrated as a hard shift in topic. In this verse, Paul said, "Now concerning the things of which you wrote to me." And by this shift, he begins to address various written questions sent to him. This demonstrates that as Paul uses this phrase 5 more times through chapter 16, he is moving from one concern raised by the Corinthians to another aspect of the same overall discussion of the things which they wrote to him about. The phrase peridei in Matthew 24:36 does not signal a transition to an entirely different event, as this would violate the inclusio structure of verses 27 through 39. Rather, peridei is a shift to emphasize an aspect of the same discussion, the unknown hour of the events already under discussion, and thus, the exhortation to watch and be ready. Another often overlooked factor is the use of the demonstrative pronoun, ikanes, rendered, that, in the phrase, that day, of verse 36. Pronouns require an antecedent, and the only antecedent in the context is the day of judgment coming upon Israel, which Jesus had been elucidating throughout the discourse. There is no basis for assuming that day suddenly points forward, referring to an end-of-time event, especially when Jesus had already established the first-century timeframe in Matthew 24:34, saying, "This generation will not pass away until all these things take place." The resurrection connection between Daniel 12 and the parable of the wheat and tares harvest of Matthew 13:37 through 43, is another critical component to understanding Jesus' teaching. Daniel 12:1 through 3, speaks of a resurrection of both the just and the unjust, which is inextricably linked to the unparalleled time of trouble, and specifically linked to the judgment of Daniel's people, that is, Israel. In Matthew 24:21, Jesus cites this prophetic text, and ties this time of trouble directly to the days of the destruction of Jerusalem. Additionally, Daniel 12, verse 3 states that, following this resurrection, the wise will turn many to righteousness. If this resurrection applies to our future as the AD 33 doctrine asserts, at this mythological end of time, how will there still be wise people turning others to righteousness, after the end of time? Clearly, this event foretold by Daniel is linked to a covenantal transformation, when the power of the holy people would be completely shattered, and not a conflagration of the material cosmos. Furthermore, Jesus cites Daniel 12:3 as the result of the harvest at the end of the age in Matthew 13, verse 43, and, again cites this same Danielic prophecy in the Olivet Discourse when explaining the end of the age judgment of Israel, applying it to the time when Jerusalem would be surrounded by armies, Luke 21, verse 20. In Luke 20:27 through 38, the Sadducees came to Jesus with a hypothetical situation based on the levirate marriage law from Deuteronomy 25:5 and 6, saying, "Moses wrote unto us," and then they presented their argument based on the stipulation from the law of Moses. Jesus responded by saying, "The sons of this age marry and are given in marriage." This clearly demonstrates that Jesus' use of the phrase, "this age," is referent to the age of Moses and the Torah. The synergy of suntelia and telos in the Olivet Discourse further confirms that the events in Matthew 24 are dealing with the covenantal end, not the end of human history. The disciples asked about ho suntelia to ionis, that is, the consummation of the age. They did not ask about the end of chronos, i.e., time. They did not ask about the end of the gay, i.e., the earth, nor did they ask about the end of the cosmos, i.e., the universe. Jesus addressed their question and said, "This gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the telos, i.e., the end, will come." Matthew 24:14. The Greek word telos refers to a goal, purpose, or objective, while suntelia signifies the consummation, the final bringing together of all components to completion. Jesus used ho suntelia to ionis, the end of the age, in Matthew 13:40 and 41. And again in verse 49, to refer to the final gathering at the harvest. The New Testament consistently speaks of the first-century believers living in the last days of the Mosaic Age. Paul told the Corinthians that the telos, that is, the goal of all the ages had come upon them, 1 Corinthians 10, verse 11, and the Hebrews writer said that Jesus appeared, once, in the suntelia, that is, the end of the ages, to put away sin by his sacrifice, Hebrews 9:26. This confirms that the age's end under discussion in Matthew 24 was not the end of the space-time continuum, but the end of the Old Covenant age of Moses. Jesus' use of festal language of the Jewish feasts in Matthew 23:39 and Matthew 24:36 provides a fuller contextual picture of the statement, no one has known the day or hour, confirming the covenantal context of the discourse. In Matthew 23:39, after castigating the hypocritical Jewish leaders, Jesus declares, "You will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" This was a direct reference to the Hallel Psalms, Psalm 118:26, which were sung during the Jewish temple feasts. This festal reference establishes the Jewish covenantal context rather than an eschatological end-of-time scenario. In Colossians 2:17, Paul states that the feasts, Sabbaths, and new moon festival were shadows of good things that were about to come, using the Greek present tense verb, melo. Among the 7 annual Jewish feasts, the new moon festival was unique in that it was the only feast for which the exact day and hour were unknown. The Israelites had to post watchmen to look for the first glimpse of the thin crescent of the new moon, which initiated the final 3 fall feasts, Leviticus 23:24 and following. This directly parallels Jesus' repeated admonition to watch for his coming in judgment against Israel, further confirming that the unknown day and hour do not indicate a subject change, but rather, in context, an application of an established Jewish festival motif foreshadowing the imminent judgment of Old Covenant Israel, and the destruction of Jerusalem. Additionally, Matthew 24:36 is not the only verse of the Olivet Discourse that speaks to the uncertainty of timing. The theme is reiterated in 3 additional passages following verse 36. Matthew 24:40-42, the unexpected separation of individuals depicting activities at differing times throughout a workday. Matthew 24:43 and 44, the parable of the thief in the night arriving unsuspectingly for those unprepared. Matthew 24:45-50, the parable of the faithful and unfaithful servant, again contrasting watchfulness versus complacency. The fact that this theme continues even into Matthew 25, reinforces the fact that Jesus was still dealing with the same overall event, the judgment of Old Covenant Israel, and the demise of Jerusalem, and the icon of Judaism, that is, the temple, as he used various parables to illustrate both the uncertainty of the specific hour, and the necessity to be watching. After illustrating the need to be prepared with the wedding parable, Jesus again said, "Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour in which the Son of Man is coming." Matthew 25:13, which is a direct reiteration of Matthew 24:36. If the unknown day and hour of the Lord's coming of Matthew 24:36 is a shift to discussing the end of time and the beginning of eternity, then to what does the unknown day and hour of the Lord's coming of Matthew 25:13 refer? Since Jesus taught his disciples that the wedding would take place at the destruction of Israel and their beloved city, Matthew 22:1-8, then the unknown day and hour of the Lord's coming of Matthew 25:13, is the unknown day and hour of the Lord's coming of Matthew 24:36. If the unknown day and hour of the Lord's coming of Matthew 25:13 is AD 70, and it unquestionably is, then the unknown day and hour of the Lord's coming of Matthew 24:36 is AD 70. And just like that, the transition verse theology of the AD 33 doctrine just evaporated. The disciples' question was never about the end of the material universe. The futurists claim that Matthew 24:36 signals a subject shift as a systemic opinion read into the text, not an exegetical conclusion derived from the text. The inclusio structure of Matthew 24:27-39, the periday shift in focus of verse 36, the demonstrative pronoun, ekanes, i.e., that, day, which requires an antecedent, the festal language of the verse, the connection between Daniel 12 and Matthew 13 to the context of the Mosaic Age, and the synergy of telos and suntelia, all affirm that Jesus was speaking of the covenantal end of the age of Moses, the judgment against Old Covenant Israel, posited in the time frame of the siege and destruction of Jerusalem in AD 67-70, not the end of the material universe.